Hello, and welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast, a production of the Sequoia Sammanbaya Studios. I am your host, Reverend Sara Jolena Wolcott, and the creator of Sequoia Sammanbaya. This podcast emerges from my own journey of remembering and reenchanting in our precarious times. For even as we find ourselves amidst multiple forms of unraveling, many of us are sensing and attending to the patterns of spirit who keeps moving within and between disciplines and sectors, time and ecologies, religious expressions and ancient living wisdom. If you are also feeling the call of the Spirit in ways that orient you and reorient you, and perhaps also your community towards our kinship with Earth, then you are in the right place. I'm delighted to bring you this episode featuring the ideas and some of the people behind the book Feed Us with Trees, Nuts and the Future of Food by writer and local food activist Elspeth Hay. When I first read this book, I felt as if I was reading both a super important message about nut trees and a journey of remembering. In her book, Elspeth both recognizes and calls out the falseness of dominant stories around food systems, what she calls the no farms, no food story. And she recovers a story that has been actively dismembered, a story of food sovereignty and the coevolution between people and trees, specifically nut trees. As with so many people who I meet who go on journeys of remembering, Elspeth met a wide array of amazing people during her process of researching and writing this book. When she and I were discussing this episode, we agreed it would be really special to actually have a chance to bring together three of the many remarkable people who influenced her thinking, but none of them had met or spent much time together. So that's what the majority of this podcast episode entails. First, though, I am going to briefly lay out the backbone of her argument. I'm using broad brushstrokes here, and I really encourage you to read her book, which is super accessible. Part of what I love about this book is that she is constantly interweaving her role as a parent, writer, cook, New Englander, and householder. In other words, she's actively working to put into practice the lessons that she learns through her research into her kitchen, her land, and her community. Okay, so let me begin where Elspeth herself does, her own childhood. Elspeth grew up on 8 acres of farm and forest in Maine. Her parents were avid bird watchers, and from them, she understood how every bird, plant, and animal was beautifully suited to its habitat. Yet she also understood that her family, like most American families, didn't source their food from their habitat. Food came from grocery stores and from farms. And farms, she quickly noticed, were created by destroying wild places. She absorbed the message that without farms that almost inevitably damage the habitat of other animals, we humans can't have food. She terms this prevailing story as a no farms, no food story. I love the simplicity with which she frames this. This story insists that monoculture farming, especially grain, corn, and soy, is the primary way to feed large populations. It casts forest tending as primitive, as something that less developed societies do before they, quote-unquote, develop into agriculture. It treats wilderness, quote-unquote, as unproductive and as a place where humans cannot live. And it has become so deeply embedded in American identity, so woven into our frontier mythology, our children's stories, even our environmental movements, that even people who care deeply about the earth rarely question it. Now, a quick note for those of you who are part of the organic or regenerative farming movement. Elspeth and certainly I honor the importance of your work. Here, we're getting into forest gardens, agroforestry, and the care for vast tree-oriented ecosystems, which is something that is too often left out of organic and regenerative conversations, even though that's been how humans have been surviving for a really long time across multiple cultures. Okay, so what did the no farms, no food story get wrong? Well, as Elspeth explains in her book, pretty much everything. Cultivating nut trees is different than cultivating grain, but it requires no less understanding and careful research, planning, and tending. We are not better off with the current models of agriculture than we would be if we were tending to forest systems for our primary foods. Modern food systems are not inherently superior to other food systems, and we can feed large populations. We can have incredible yield and scale with forest ecosystems. Nut trees produce a huge and densely nutritious yield, far more than many grains. Indeed, I really appreciate how Elspeth gets into some of the numbers around yield and the mirage. Please go read her book to get into some of that very important detail. She also chronicles many nut growers who are currently experimenting with different ways to increase that yield, as well as moving into diverse, multi-species tree communities that provide habitat to many edible plants, as well as animals and insects. Doing so returns the land to something closer to what it was before the arrival of the European colonists. Much of what is now the United States and Canada was once covered in oak savannas, rich, multi-layered ecosystems abundant with acorns, chestnuts, hazelnuts, fruits, and grasses that fed deer, turkey, quail, and rabbits. And humans, too. These were not passive wildernesses waiting to be quote-unquote improved, as early European colonial writers suggested. They were ecosystems tended by the indigenous peoples who lived there, often with fire, working with waterways, keeping down pests, and all sorts of related activities. Today, most Americans can't think of acorns as food, and yet, properly processed to remove their tannins, they are extraordinarily nutritious, containing more protein, healthy fat, carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals than the same amount of wheat or corn. Acorn-eating cultures have existed in China, Korea, Japan, the Mediterranean, Europe, North America, and the Middle East for at least 12,000 years. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, noted that acorns constitute the wealth of many nations. As Elspeth was researching acorns, she came across Ron Reed, a member of the Karuk Nation in Northern California, a community that has been tending to the mountains and rivers of the Klamath River Basin in ways that contribute to an extraordinarily abundance of both salmon and acorns for thousands of years. Some of you might have heard me and others talk about the remarkable and largely successful efforts to get rid of the dams along the Klamath River, which Ron was involved in. We are delighted that Ron joins us in this conversation. In Ron's community, there are over 90 words related to acorns. He describes humans as the fire animals, the species whose ecological niche was to put fire on the land through regular cultural burns, creating habitat and food for the more than human community. Over 75% of what he calls cultural use species, plants, fish, animal, fungi, need fire to reproduce. This includes oak trees. In this cosmology, humans are keystone species. In this cosmology, humans actively use fire to help all other creatures. There is a place for humans in this ecosystem. Since the colonizers arrived in the Klamath River Basin, at least 25 traditional Karuk foods have disappeared. In 2015, more than 91% of Karuk households experienced some level of food insecurity. His people are absolutely not healthier since the coming of colonization and its accompanying food system. Recognizing that our current food system has actually caused greater illness than did pre-colonial food systems is a really important part of debunking the prevailing no farms, no food story. On her journey to understand where this no food, no farm story came from, Elspeth eventually finds some answers in England. and the relationship between colonial America and England in the 15th and 16th centuries. If you've taken the Remembering course with me, you will be familiar with some of the history of the breakdowns of the English commons, in which, in part because of the colonization of Turtle Island, raising sheep for wool becomes much more profitable than keeping peasants cultivating the land as they had tended it for generations. As a result, the commons were enclosed, peasants were forced off of their traditional homeland, and many people had little choice but to migrate to the Americas, often as indentured servants, carrying with them the trauma of becoming landless. In this conversation, we're joined by Joanna Brooks, who looks into these histories. She's a literary professor at San Diego State University and the author of Why We Left: Untold Stories and Songs of America's First Immigrants. She helps us understand the traumatic histories of dislocation that early settlers carried with them and how these shape the food and land stories they brought to this continent. Especially for those of you who are interested in songs as places of cultural memory, I strongly recommend her book, which I really enjoyed reading. Nor were practices of commenting entirely left behind by British settlers who migrated, sometimes with very few options, to what we now call the United States. Elspeth chronicles how in early American colonies, chestnut trees provided so much food that in some communities, especially in the Appalachian Mountains, they were both a staple food and were translated into a kind of local currency. Prior to the Civil War, much of the mountainous terrains were reserved as lands held in common, even as valleys were divided into private property. Some of the Appalachian counties retained common use practices as recently as the 1980s. As Elspeth was researching the history of the breakdown of the commons, she learned that many of the ancient commoning practices do still survive in England. And so we are joined here in this episode by Gale Pettifer, a historian and a commoner who herself tends an ancient breed of ponies, in the New Forest in England. Part of the power of remembering these old stories more accurately is that we begin to see how much is still here and how much of ancestral knowledge and contemporary practices we can draw upon to return to healthier foodways. Throughout her book, Elspeth lifts up that returning to food systems based on acorns, chestnuts, hazelnuts, and other bundles of nutrition entails a significant shift in how we see our place in the world. We can become keystone pieces who tend to the well-being of large ecosystems. These nut trees often need the kinds of controlled burns that humans can offer, and they provide avenues for biodiversity that the contemporary food system does not. Thus, humans currently and once again have a chance not just to be blights on our ecosystem, but to become what is our rightful place, relatives tending to and being tended by our kin. Alrighty, hopefully this is enough of an overview to help set the stage for this conversation. Welcome to the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. I am your hostess, Reverend Sara Jolena Wolcott, and I am so delighted today to be joined with a wonderful collection of guests that have been inspired. This podcast is inspired by a recent book by Elspeth Hay called Feed Us with Trees, Nuts and the Future of Food. And as soon as I read the first chapter of this book, I knew I wanted to have Elspeth on our podcast as she charts the journey from her own journey. She uses sort of her own story to kind of chart this much bigger story of going from the belief that many people who are brought up in America and the different parts of what's now the U.S., Canada, and other parts of the world, that without farms, you won't have food. And she describes this as a no food, no farm story. And the extent to which that story is false has been the cause of much damage. And that it is actually entirely possible to feed a global population on in a forested way with trees and particularly nut trees. And that her own journey took her on a process of engaging with colonial histories, engaging with Indigenous peoples here in America, and engaging with peoples in England and other parts of her European heritage, all of which are themes that we talk a fair amount about in the Remembering and Reenchanting podcast. So when Elspeth and I were talking about how to put this podcast together, I said it might be nice to invite some of the people that she met on her journey to have this conversation with her, so we don't have to hold this conversation by ourselves. Part of her work and part of this larger work is very much that these are not conversations any one of us can or probably should try to have all by ourselves in our own little echo chamber. And so we have actually three folks that she has been a part, that have been a major part of her journey and a part of this bigger question of how do we relate to Earth? How do we relate to one another? How do we relate to our ancestors? How do we eat in a way that is really healthy and supportive of everyone? So Elspeth, I'm gonna, thank you so much for coming in. I'm gonna invite you to introduce some of the other folks who are in the space with us.
Thank you so much for having us. It's really exciting to me to have everyone in the same space for a minute because each of you is really important to me. So thank you for coming. I'll introduce Ron here. Ron Reed. Ron, how did we become friends? I guess I got an introduction to Ron when I read a book called Salmon and Acorns Feed Our People. And I contacted the author, and she put Ron and I in touch, and we started talking about acorns during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic on Zoom. And Ron is an Indigenous Karuk, member of the Karuk tribe, cultural biologist, extremely knowledgeable human overall, and had so many interesting conversations together. So I'm excited that Ron is here and willing to be part of this today. Joanna Brooks, hi Joanna, wrote an amazing book called Why We Left that traced the story of some early colonial settlers through song. And this is a book that really changed the way that I saw my own people's history, and was really an incredibly important part of the learning about my own ancestry and history that accompanied this journey. And last, we have Gale, who I believe, Gale Pettifer, it is midnight for her right now, and she is valiantly joining us anyways. Thank you, Gale. You are amazing. And Gale is a commoner in England, keeps animals on the commons at the New Forest, and is also a scholar of the commons and enclosure, which, if listeners don't know about enclosure, I'm sure we will touch on that tonight. So thank you, Gale, and thank you all of you for just agreeing to do this. It's really special.
Yeah, it is really special. The gathering and the forces that are enabling the many years of work that each of you have put into to your own understandings. I thought one way we could start is to invite everyone to share a story. And I actually wonder, Ron, is it okay if we start with you and just invite you to share a story as a way of introduction and kind of bringing people in to some of the questions that you're asking and some of which you're engaging with right now?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Ron Reed, I'm a Karuk tribal member. I belong to the second largest tribe in California. We depend on fire, you know, for sustainability over time. And so I think that's the beauty of the acorn. I was supposed to be on a podcast with Elspeth. I missed it. I was disappointed. I contacted her anyway. We developed this, this conversation about acorns. And over time, she come out and visited and is really inspired, I think, both of us to kind of create a mutual understanding across the aisle, if you will, almost across the ocean, if you will. The theme today, the European impact, or I look at it, European impact and in a European theme lifestyle, right? So it's kind of very interesting, but very diverse. And I guess maybe a short little story for me is basically, that my first memories as a child was collecting traditional foods, acorns, mushrooms, while my uncles hunted for a deer right in the same little management unit and packing fish out of Ishipishi Falls, where I'm a fisherman today. And all that's attributed to the fire on the landscape. Those are the same things I practice today. Those are the same things my children practice. And right now, my job is to more try to formalize that in the broader society so we can all see the benefits, not only from the cultural perspective, but from a public trust perspective as well. So that's kind of like, in a nutshell, what I'm trying to do, use Indigenous knowledge to be able to tell our story, and using Indigenous knowledge as a tribal lead in the early 2000s with the Klamath Dam removal, utilizing that sense of information and ideology to allow people to understand that water is just not water, a salmon is just not salmon, and the Karuk people are just not Karuk people. We all are interconnected, and we manage the world in such a way that it can make sense to all of us if we give it a chance. And that's all we want. So now we are having opportunities in the era of fire suppression. Back in the day, part of our story was Indigenous fire got taken away from us. Hence now, fast forward to 2026, fire is a big problem. It's because we do not manage fire. We have the way to go about it. The Karuk tribe is leading the nation in prescribed fire with cultural objectives. My goal is to start Indigenous fire with public trust objectives. Yotua.
I know many people who've been so deeply inspired by the work that your people have done with the removal of the dams on the Klamath River. It's had, so much both national and global inspirational powers, and many people who have been inspired to take up different forms of cultural burning and to try to bring those practices alive again. And it really is both the story of water and the story of fire and the story of acorns are all so deeply connected. And so, so much gratitude to you and your people. Gale, can we go to you next? Is there a story that you would like to share as a form of introduction?
So I have common rights on the New Forest, which is it's now a national park in the southern part of England, quite close to the coast. And a lot of the reason that it survived as the landscape it has is because of its association with royalty and also the Navy. So the Navy wanted to harvest the trees from the early modern period onwards. Prior to that, the commoners had been left to exploit the resources with their cattle, ponies. They used the landscape for subsistence living, and it was actually known as a wilderness-like landscape. But my interest in the New Forest as a commoner was in the 18th century onwards, when it started to be exploited by landowners in Parliament, who used the experience of how they managed their own landscapes to suddenly try and manage this wilderness-like landscape. And how they actually tried to get rid of the commoners because the rights, the ancient rights that they held, proved to be a really big problem. So it's a landscape that has always been contested. It's very political, but to most observers, it's one of the most beautiful landscapes in England, with ponies that roam through the villages, and the ponies have rights of way. And it's one of the reasons people come in absolute awe. And it's the type of landscape that I think parts of it, William the Conqueror, who designated it as a hunting landscape in 1079, would still recognise today. And that's one of the attractions. And so the ancient common rights that that were enshrined in the laws that William the Conqueror laid down are still being practiced today. And in the 21st century, I find that absolutely remarkable, that I'm still doing something that's been practiced for nearly 1,000 years.
Especially since so many people forget that those common laws still exist in England.
Yes.
And that they were part of America in different parts of America for quite some time. We've been taught to forget that the commons from England and Europe have been all but part of the past only, and not part of the present.
Yes.
So from California, from an Indigenous community in California, we just listened to Gale, who's based in Southern England. We're now going to go back geographically to California again. And Joanna, I'm wondering if you can share something about what's you've been thinking about and working on in this area of trees and food and people.
Sure. So I'm a settler scholar, is a term we use among people in my field to indicate that, my ancestry is European primarily, so Indigenous peoples from the Basque Country, from Ireland, from Wales, from Britain, which is a separate region from where Anglo-Saxon folks were, but also Anglo-Saxon folks. And I had the really good fortune of studying during my training with Paula Ganallan, who is a professor of American Indian Studies, and a lot of other folks in the Indigenous Studies program at UCLA. And, I was studying it in order to be a good scholar of American Indian literature and culture, in order to be able to teach it well, and in order to be able to incorporate it in my own scholarship on early America, on early North America, by which I mean colonial North America, this unfortunate way those terms slide into each other, but that's how the phrase is used in the field. And, after many, many years of studying and other cultures and how other cultures operated in these spaces, I came renewed to seek to connect with my own story, because my ancestors, I know how we got here. I know when we arrived. I know where we were from. What I didn't fully know how to tell was the story of why we left, which was my book that I published about 10 years ago now. And so, not having access to written memory, I did what Paula taught me to do, which is to listen deep to songs and stories. And I was searching. I grew up in Southern California as a little girl in the suburbs. But my grandmother sang a lullaby to me that I was able to figure out her grandmother came from the Derby region in England. And it talked about woods, and it talked about strawberries, and it talked about robins. And it was the lullaby I grew up with. And I realized, seeing it through the eyes I had been taught to see with by Paula and by other esteemed, beloved teachers, that those elements of being, those relatives, was where we were from, that this was a map. And I worked as hard as I could to follow any hints I had back across all those miles and all those centuries. And I'll close with this part. I found myself one day standing with my kids in the British Museum looking at the Sutton Hoo, and the great ruins of an unearthed burial site. And there was a plate of hazelnuts. And I had written why we left at that point, and I knew, and maybe we'll talk about hazelnuts and their importance. And I knew why hazelnuts were important, but the curation of the British Museum said, we don't really know why these hazelnuts were here in this burial. And the irony just floored me. I am sitting here in the British Museum. They have samples, Ron, of like the woven hats from my friend Kutcha, who lives up north near you, wears in the flower dance for her kids, like in some of the NorCal tribes. Like they have so much stuff from the rest of the world that they feel so expert in taking and curating. And we don't know how to tell our own story about hazelnuts and the way that they are folded into sacred stories among British and Celtic people. And it just, I was just laughing by myself in the British Museum and glad that I knew I had some context for understanding hazelnuts. They don't have to symbolize anything. They just were. They fed us, they nurtured us, they sustained us, and they were in our burials, right? And all of this memory being lost has been one of the great preoccupations for me of the last few years.
Beautiful, if I may. Um, it really, several things kind of came to mind when you was talking, but at the end, when you wrapped that, we started talking about lullabies. I kind of have a little negative response, like one little, two little, three little Indians, that kind of a lullaby, you know what I mean? So it's kind of like, that's kind of like from the side, that's where I come from, but that quickly went away. And that quickly went away. I'm training myself to kind of like, okay, what is the message here? And the message is the lullabies. That's your history. That's how you guys went about telling the story. And we have the same way. I think that's what I said, Elspeth. I've been telling her, that we have our ceremonies that guide us and our creation stories that ground us, and using fire as the oldest teacher on earth type stuff, that philosophy, right? And Acorns just happen to feed a lot of creatures, so the chestnut in the burial, there are certain things, but then you don't know personal relationships with other non-human relatives. Okay, so Kutcha Riesling, yeah, Baldy Riesling, I believe. Yeah, good friend of ours as well, and she does well. And thanks a lot for me being here and having the opportunity to share and listen and learn too.
It's beautiful. I I just keep thinking as everyone's sharing these stories of all of the layered connections that have come out of these conversations, and I'm thinking, Gale, of when I was over in England in the New Forest, talking with Gale and Anne, who is not here, but who is also a commoner in the New Forest with Gale. And Anne was taking me all around. And this was after I had spent some time with Ron, really learning about fire and the importance of fire to maintaining some of these really important plants and other relative species on the landscape. And um, one of the first things that I learned in the New Forest is that fire has also been a really important element there. Anne was showing me the ponies, and we were sort of trying to get closer to them, and we were walking through, I think, Gale, correct me if I get this wrong, but I think it was gorse, which I was completely unfamiliar with, this plant that I had never met but had read about in Winnie the Pooh and childhood books like that. And I had no context for gorse. But then Anne started telling me how there was this big dispute between the commoners and some of the sort of environmentalist, Western science type managers of the New Forest, who didn't want the commoners to keep burning the gorse because they were worried about pollutants or fires getting out of control. And I had this moment of standing there, thousands of miles away from where I had visited Ron, and thinking, oh my gosh, it's just the same argument. It's like these people who have been here forever, who know how to manage this land and have been in relationship with this place for so long, and then sort of these people who come in from the city or from Europe or from somewhere else, and are saying, no, 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 we know better how to manage this land, you can't do that anymore. And it's just this story that has played out so many times on repeat. And it's beautiful to see those connections, and then to hear Ron, you and Joanna, those layers of song and connection. And so I'll just I'll leave it there. But right away,
I agree with you. Anne was my mentor, and she's a 13th generation commoner, and she has an almost instinctive symbiosis with the forest. But burning is very important in the New Forest. It actually prevents wildfires because the things like the gorse don't get out of control, and it also makes sure that there's enough young shoots for the animals to eat. So it's much better for the landscape. When they've burnt the gorse, you'll notice that the ponies make their way onto the charcoal that's left behind, the stalks of gorse, and they actually eat this as a form of medication. So ponies, the wild ponies or the semi-wild ponies on the forest do self-medicate, and the charred stalks of gorse are really, really good for them, and helps them with internal parasites, tummy upsets, that kind of thing. So fire is really, really important as a land management and even animal management tool on the forest.
That's incredibly similar
Mm.
to my belief system. It's all about fire periodicity, and what it's the spirit of fire and what you're asking fire to do. And we believe they know the spirit of fire knows our language, much like the spirit of the animals and the landscape knows our language. So I think that's where I think it fits very parallel to indigenous communities in Europe, even though that it isn't really readily known to me. But the more I know about the world and how it works by different scholars and what have you, but it's all interconnected, and the stories are very similar, like we're talking about today. Those shoots are with basketry materials as well. And it's all connected to the 13 moon cycle and our ceremonies, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's a world ideology, much like yours, and is sharing the same components of relationships built with our non-human relations, and actually mimicking them to be able to utilize for our own loved ones when it's a time of need. So very amazing.
So the controlled burning in the forest only takes place in the off season, so in the kind of winter season. So there's no nesting birds. There's no the deer aren't breeding. The ponies aren't giving birth, and the cattle. So it's not done all year round. It's actually controlled to make sure that it's optimized in terms of its efficacy without actually bringing too much harm to the landscape and the wildlife. It's actually it's part of the management.
Yeah, I would just agree with you to say that fire is a big no-no when, after the mating, when babies are being hatched, or being are growing, but we have astronomical indicators by the stars of when we can burn, when we start burning, when we stop burning. Mm-hmm. So we have a very intricate system that allows us to avoid that, but still rely on our knowledge for optimal levels of management. So we don't have that dead period. That no fire period for that extreme time. That's the time we're going out and burning for our basketry materials, our hazelnuts, our acorns, and medicinal plants, teas, all these different things in the landscape, from the high country all the way down to the floodplain on the river. So it's kind of very, it's specialized. And I think that's the reason why we're talking about it today, isn't because of the knowledge system. I think it's always been known. Now that you're sharing like you are, it's because of fire suppression. And that, again, it's for what you was talking about earlier. It's kind of like the big government coming in, and now fire suppression is how do we fix this thing? And natives, and we have an idea how to do it, and they're giving us a chance. And it kind of like it's really advantageous to Indigenous worldview international. So
I'm curious, Gale. I know that in Ron's communities and many of the cultural burning, fire tending practices of Native peoples across this land, the process of cultural burning, the process of that tender, caring burning, is one that is accompanied with song and with a strong sense of the sacred. And I'm curious, like, is there a sense of, do you sing songs when you burn fire in the New Forest today? And if not, do you think that used to be the case?
So the practice of controlled burning used to be done by the commoners. It's actually now done by the land managers.
Oh, interesting.
So Forestry England, which is part of the ministry that the New Forest now falls under, they actually manage it. So that's been taken away from the commoners. So it's done more as a process rather than a part of the cultural calendar. So most activities that involve commoning, because of the very nature of it, it involves people working together, because you can't manage herds of semi-feral ponies unless you all work in concert. So, and the same with controlled burning. So these are always opportunities. The commoners are absolutely wonderful people, and it's whenever they get together, there's always opportunities to share stories. So that's something that I've noticed. So I'm not sure about singing songs, although they may have done. But certainly for getting together, telling gossip and sharing stories.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, I would like to think that was also part of that English tradition. That there were times when the fire was seen as sacred and not simply as as well as utilitarian, and that those things went together. I would like to imagine that was once the case.
And fire was seen as regenerative rather than destructive.
Do you know when that changed in English history?
I think it probably changed when processes became more scientific.
So, like with the industrial, like in the midst of the Industrial Revolution
and the Agricultural Revolution. Certainly, the Agricultural Revolution in the forest, when they began to introduce enclosures into these open landscapes and try and build plantations of trees. The practices that the commoners had always used of natural regeneration were taken out of the commoners' hands, and this idea of science became the way people actually tried to do things. So, and I'm not talking about science in the way we do it today. Today we do it with experiments, and we actually see what works and what doesn't. During the Agricultural Revolution, lots of absolutely what we'd think today of ludicrous ideas. It wasn't experimentation. A lot of it was guesswork. A lot of it came from religious belief. So things like trying to plant trees, where the commoners would say, "Oh, I wouldn't plant." Trees had never been in parts of the forest where they tried to put the trees, and the commoners told them this. But the landowners, who were in Parliament, tried to introduce ideas that they had for managing their own estates into this wilderness landscape. And in many ways it didn't work at all. Some of the ideas that they had did not work at all.
You know, Gale, it strikes me just as someone who thinks a lot about story and song, and recognizing that you have a very lived relationship to like which songs are still happening, which stories are still happening, but taking a very distant view. It strikes me that fire was sacred. Fire-breathing creatures are sacred in early Anglo-Saxon texts like Beowulf, right? And so fire is seen as something powerful, and it's in so many cultures that are saddled with colonialism. The introduction of Christianity introduces these polarities where things that are powerful can then become bad powerful or good, and the fire breathing dragon becomes in the later medieval lore, you know, a creature associated with what's more sinister, but it wasn't always that way. Do you see what I'm saying? So like we can trace in this very deep, broad fossil record of story, when fire changes from something that is just seen as powerful to something that is seen as something to be feared. And I wonder if that loosely parallels some of the broader shifts in history.
It's interesting you say that because there is a very famous dragon in the New Forest. And the story is that it used to fly down to Bolton's Bench, which is near Lyndhurst in the New Forest. And the locals would have to leave a pail of milk for it to drink. And then there's the inevitable night comes along and slays the dragon. And there's actually a mound at Bolton's Bench where the dragon is supposed to be buried. And the hilt of the knight's sword is the yew tree that grows now on top of the mound. But the belief is that this was actually, rather than being a dragon, it was actually a rabid pig. And that it wasn't milk that it was drinking, it was the foam around the mouth. But this is how these stories get kind of over the telling. They become more, dramatized. So interesting in what you say, that this dragon they believe was actually a rabid pig.
Controlling the narrative.
Yeah. And fear, people would have been terrified of it either way.
Joanna, I love the perspective that you're bringing in around song. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about your book was the way that, and I think you and I had a conversation about this, when you're following back some of these English ballads and songs to the time when so many English people were leaving England and coming as colonial settlers to North America. I remember you saying that that one of the first things you noticed was that these weren't happy songs. I'm just thinking about that fear that Gale is referencing. Whether it's a fire-breathing dragon or a rabid pig. Both of those stories are sort of capturing that same emotion. And I just wonder if you could talk about that sort of emotion tracing a little bit through song, because so much of my conversations with all three of you have been about how these stories about our relationship to place have changed with colonialism, and with that sort of rupture between people and place. And I can trace it back to my own childhood. Growing up in Maine, my parents were bird watchers, and that was what they did for their job. They were writing a bird watcher's guide to the coast of Maine. And we went all over the state looking at birds in different habitats and learning about all the ways they were adapted to these habitats. But in none of those stories and on none of those adventures, there was never a place for us as people. We were outside observers looking at these other creatures that were perfectly adapted. And then we would go get our food from these industrial farms that were destroying those same ecosystems. And it didn't seem like we were had a place on this landscape. And I think one thing that your work did so beautifully was really bring that story to life for me of why those of us who are of colonial descent would feel that way and would have those sort of stories. I hope that makes
Yeah.
sense, but yeah.
Oh, sure. And, I love hearing the story about your parents and being bird watchers, but not having like a place in that relationship, right? They were observers, right? And of never belonging anywhere. Because one of the things that set off my work was, so I have this Brooks ancestral line. And as far as we can tell, they got here really early, probably 17th century. I mean, I have documented some folks who came in 16th, but like 17th century. And, they are poor people. They are poor people. They are the kind of English people who were enclosed off of some land where they made sense at some point in time and wandered around and there's lots of literature in 16th and 17th century England about the people who were pushed off or who became masterless men and were wandering and were vagabonds, because there was no place for them to be. And so they get here and then like they don't hold land anywhere. They don't own land. They don't belong anywhere. And it's one long string of moving from, South Carolina to Alabama to Texas to West Texas to Arizona to working copper mines till we ended up in LA working for the government building dams and breakwaters, right? And at no point did we belong anywhere. And I think about, and the men on that side, there is so much grief, violence, loss, hardship inscribed into every part of that story that comes down through their bodies, through my body. And, it can be crazy making to listen to early American history as told normally, where it's like, oh, it's so great. And there's this patriotic thing. And you're like, but then why were we such jerks? Like, why were we so violent and tortured and rootless? Like, how do these things line up? And so, looking back, like trying to find the key to that memory was in the songs because the songs for years and years, they interpreted folklore like it was symbolic, not like it actually meant anything, like in America at least. And these are songs that were on both sides of the Atlantic. They came with, first of all, they were all basically murder ballads. Like nobody's happy. Nobody's happy here. None of the songs that survive are like, ain't it great? We are friends with Ron and his family. We're learning the language. We're doing well. We're gonna be good neighbors. Like they're all like, somebody killed somebody and we ran away. And there was one in which a brother kills his brother over a beaver hat. And that's like random, like, oh, how funny. Medieval times. Well, turns out the beaver trade, hello, like it was ruinous. And it created these consumer economies in England that did turn people against each other. And there's one about a hazel tree, right? And that had been interpreted for years as a brother kills a brother because he cut down this hazel tree. It's like, oh, it must be all the folklorists in the universities in the 1930s must be about incest because we all know a tree and a bush and it's all related. And somebody slept with somebody's little sister and they got mad. And I'm like, what if it's actually a hazel tree? And you, you go back, you're like, well, of course it was a hazel tree. That's how they ate. That's how they got through the winter. There were rules about trees. You probably didn't cut, and that was before I knew what I came to find out, right? It's, no, they're killing each other because people are cutting down the trees and there's nowhere to eat and people are starving and out of their minds. And that is what made my family history made sense. People were starving and they were out of their minds and they had no place to be. They had been severed from the places we were originally from, where all of our songs were from, our stories were from, our ancestors, the spirits of our dead. Like, if you're far away from your ancestral kin, who is holding you accountable? That's why they acted like they had lost their minds. It weren't that we were just bad people. All these Brooks relatives of mine, right, who were cranky and violent and marginally employed and moving to a less and less forested place over hundreds of years until we're like kicking rocks in the desert. Literally, nothing wrong with the desert if you're from there, but we did not belong there. And that's how I understand the violence and the suffering in my family line, right? And understanding this because we're just really, really far from home. We are 500 years from our forests. We've lost our minds, which kind of helps me understand the United States of America. At least the settlers, right? But thank you for allowing me to share that grief because, like, I just couldn't square the grief that I was living through those family lines or witnessing through those family lines with the stories that were being told in books. I couldn't square them, and I had to do better.
the more I hear about history, the more everything falls into place for me. I mean, I'm learning so much today, and, I think it goes back to, Elspeth, outside of the bird watching. We are too. But that's our next, we're taught that's our next to kin. That's our kind of like, that's what got our people. That's what my email is poofage is dear. People are named after things they love and people and you learn about those things and it's embedded in your genetics and et cetera, et cetera. So we're trying to always mimic nature, and we mimic nature. Marriage, we hold high bald-headed eagles because they mate for life. Wolves mate for life. Otters mate for life. All these things are the key elements in our regalia species, and we try to act like those. They all have different qualities of life. So as human beings, it's our job to feed all those resources, and then they come back and teach us. That's the reciprocity that we'll always be looking for. And for some reason, I know that was over in Europe, but now it's over here. The German, that's where our forestry program is from Germany, turning our forests into commodities. And now we're kind of fighting that dilemma. They come in and again, it sounded very familiar to our friend here when we're not actually doing our management neither. The government is coming in and burning our country and prescribed fire. We're giving them information in survivorship and basically knowledge extraction so we can participate. But that's my job, is to bring it from the community, bring it from the spirit of earth to the spirit of all of our resources that have no voices. That's the ceremonial leadership that I've put on my shoulders. And it's important to me to make sure that policy, fire, represents both sides of the aisle in America. And if we can kind of bring those together, we can create a hybrid that looks at community first, the way all of our societies have originated from. So I think a lot of those different things that we're talking about today is beautiful. Appreciative to be here and to be a part of this conversation. And so thank you all.
It's curiously, when the forest was first created by William the Conqueror in about 1079, he introduced laws that were incredibly brutal for the people that lived on the royal forests on those lands. So you could, even if you owned the land, you were not allowed to erect fences. You were not allowed to clear the land for growing crops. And if you disturbed the deer, you could have your hand cut off, you could be blinded, castrated, or even face the death penalty. And there's an instrument in the museum here, which is called Rufus Stirrup, but it was actually a tool for measuring dogs. And a dog the size of a terrier, a small terrier, would fit through this device. Any dog larger that couldn't fit through the device would be lamed by having the two front toes of its front paws amputated. And that prevented the dog from chasing deer, because these places where forest law prevailed was all about preserving the deer for elite hunting. So over time, the laws that were there to protect elite sports actually began to be used by the commoners, and slowly over time, this is how common law has become enshrined in ancient law and is protected even to this day. So there was a trade-off.
Yes.
And over time, the more stringent laws. So Magna Carta came in and gave rights to noblemen, so that the king could no longer, no king was kind of above the law. Then a couple of, in 1217, the Commoners' Charter was introduced, and this gave rights to free men. the same that the barons had been given in Magna Carta, and things like the laming of dogs, the blinding, the castrating, all those kinds of things were off the table, so that over time, commoners' rights have become more enshrined.
Yep.
And in fact, in 1877, so we're just about to celebrate next year 150 years. In 1877, the government finally came to its senses and realised that the New Forest needed to be protected. People from all over the country were absolutely incensed that the government was going to sell it off, which they were. They were going to sell it off, and it was going to go into private land ownership, and we would have lost this amazing landscape and resource. But people up and down the country that lived in factories and worked in mines wanted somewhere in England, the thought that there would be somewhere where there were trees, where there were open spaces, where there were wild animals still kind of roaming. It caused such a public outcry that the government decided that they would protect the New Forest. So 1877, they introduced the New Forest Act, and that's how we've got things like the Verderers Court, which administers the commoning system. And so now it's protected. So those initial laws that were brought in by the elites to protect their own interests actually had the impact of also enshrining common law, commoners' rights as well.
Gale, one of the things I've wondered, and this is something that would connect your story, my story, Elspeth's story, Ron's story, is whether some of the harmful practices of thinking about land as an object, surveying land, regulating land, afforesting, restricting lands from the indigenous people who inhabit there, if the colonizing techniques that English descended people used in the US were not derived from their own experiences of being colonized during the Norman conquest, right? I wonder if what happened to my ancestors, we did to indigenous people here, right? So there's almost like a passing on of those traumas of the land being enclosed, afforested, people who actually belong there, punished just for being in relationship with their lands, right? Like, so is there any chance there's like a chain of transmission, right, from moving the conquest forward?
Interesting you say about a train of transmission, and for me, it's gone the opposite way. So being a commoner, people ask me when with my free roaming ponies, so they can roam wherever they like, but they tend to stay in territories. And people say to me, what's the point of having them? Because you can't groom them, you can't ride them, you can't. But for me, they've taught me so much about the landscape because I have to think about where they're going to be. Has it been cold the night before? Has it been raining? Is it windy? Which way's the wind coming? They're going to be sheltering on the kind of on the south side. If it's been really, really cold overnight, they'll be in the morning, they'll be high up on a hill somewhere facing the sun to get warm. They've taught me so much. And I think it's within us all, but it needs to be reawakened in the same way that, as you were saying, that transmission that went the other way, where it was kind of beaten out of people. Their connection to the land has actually been beaten out of them. Whereas commoning for me has just opened up this world of I would never experience the landscape in the way that I have done, and that's what my ponies have taught me.
I'm hearing so many dots connecting. I'm thinking about What you're saying, Joanna, about that chain of transmission, one thing that I was noticing when I was reading both colonial history in North America and also previous and sort of simultaneous history in the British Isles and England in particular, was how much of the language overlaps when we're talking about the English enclosures and what's going on in the 1800s in present day United States. I noticed one of the words that jumped out to me right away, and Ron, I know you'll recognize this word, was the word allotment. Because it, it kept talking about these British gardens, these English gardens with, or these houses, sorry, not gardens, with their little allotment, sort of. And this, Gale, correct me if I'm wrong, but this seemed to mostly reference people in more urban settings or suburban settings, people who had been disconnected from rural landscapes, and what they were left with was what was called an allotment. And then when I was reading about Indigenous history in present day United States in the 1800s, there was the introduction of an allotment system where land that had been reserved as tribal land, then allotting agents from the federal government came in and forced Indigenous communities to divide that land between individuals, even when that wasn't what people wanted, when it made no sense, and force them to farm it in ways that made no sense. Ron, I can let you speak to that a bit. I'll let you jump in because you know much more than I do. But those words just echoing each other across the ocean really stuck out to me when I was reading those histories.
Yeah, when I'm listening to you folks, it just seems like I'm calling it adjusted timeline across the world. I'm learning in dam removal that similar atrocities happen around the world. So I think we all know where that pattern. The allotments, the best way I can put it is that in the era of giving out reservations for taking land, we signed a treaty, 1.4 million square acres for land, for give that for a reservation and fishing, hunting, and gathering rights forever. And we never got that. The California Gold Rush 1850 hit, and then the county wouldn't allow that to happen. And basically, we went into shattered existence. During an allotment period, that's kind of one of the, I guess, the tokens that we got. I'm not sure exactly the story. They don't teach us history very well here in America, so I would just say that, that's the part of the allotments. And I'll just add this too, is that my name's on three Native, I think it's Indian allotments, they call it. Three Indian allotments. But basically, all the land that my people gave up for this little place, we there's laws against us to go in and build a house on it, go in and do anything, put fire on it or anything like that. So there's so many restrictions, and it's a colonial by nature, So I think that allotment era is still something that's kind of like in a shattered existence for us, without a ratified treaty. We're one step out of being not federally recognized. Federally recognized is kind of like the golden, I guess, the golden pathway to success in America. But if you're not federally recognized, you're not on that pathway. But we're right in the middle. That makes me, doesn't allow me, it makes me go out and search and do the things through public policy, land policy, what makes sense from over here. So I think we're getting there nowadays. So I really appreciate the opportunity for people like you, Elspeth, to kind of come in and listen, and to come in and actually not only listen, but to hear us and to kind of like apply that across the knowledge systems. And now we have the ability now to start managing for ourselves, start sharing that. And my job is to come back and grab the community, much like the indigenous nature of all of our conversations here, right? What's good for the community? The commoner, I was going to ask, what's a commoner? But I know now, right? And I think, and me, I'm just an indigenous person that had an inherent responsibility to promote life over time. I just happen to be a ceremonial leader that, my inherent responsibility is a little bit stronger. So everything we're talking about here is very relevant to the life that I'm leading right now. I'm working through academia. I do have publications. I am on the UC Berkeley CNAC, the Culture Advisory Committee for the Chancellor. I'm doing NAFRI, National Advanced Fire Resource Institute. They're teaching the Forest Service, but there's no economic structure on our side of the aisle to be able to promote the lifestyle that I believe in, that I'm proven. And we need to have a structure that is a compatibility structure, that they just can't come and extract our information and move on. We need to start teaching the next generation the same way America taught their generation during the Industrial Revolution. Just so happens that model is outdated, and not to mention it's flawed. So I think it's time to start over again. And I think the common ground here is what makes sense and how can we kind of get back to community-based management.
Yeah. One thing I noticed when that comes right to mind when you're saying that, Ron, is the history, it seems so different in England in terms of there was an internal colonization of the country, but people who lived through that also stayed in that place, if that makes sense. So it's like that history couldn't be obscured in the same way that people Indigenous communities in America and Indigenous communities in England have both held on to this colonial history in a strong way, whereas the history that I learned in school, in public school, as sort of settler history in North America, just like deleted that entire chapter and glosses over it. And then nothing makes sense when you grow up with that version of history. And so like you and Gale are both and Joanna's research, it's all speaking to this. We need to bring that back up so that we can tell the truth and understand what actually happens in order to move forward together. Without those pieces, it's really difficult to have a real conversation when we don't have a shared understanding of history and power structures and education and all of that.
I really appreciate all this, and I just kind of cannot overemphasize. I haven't said it yet. So it's kind of basically just remember that my people they tried to exterminate us for the use of fire, to come back and give the general population, the people that need it the most, we're still there. That's what we believe in, who we are, the ideology, and I'm sure everybody around this little round table that we have, the cyber table that we have here, I think feel the same way. So I think that's the beauty of what your, of folks of your, various stature. We have academia, we have commoners, we have native, we have everybody that kind of puts this story together in a linear capacity that I've learned more today than I have in years and years of learning about the world, about a lot of different things. Just by now I kind of know where allotments and the common law type stuff and, all these different things that we borrowed from Europe to come over here. And I've always known there's a systemic, because I was always told, that was in my mind, I had the chance not to have to self-medicate, or you have the choice of what food you want to eat, or if you want to make something out of yourself or not. But intergenerational trauma, historical trauma from being exterminated, near extermination on it, and then trying to go through survivorship to do god-awful things to take care of your family to reach to where we're at today. So I just would like to thank you for being able to acknowledge that story, not only to acknowledge it, but to hear it, and then to have that level of empathy, not just for this guy or this people, but it's about the world around us. And I think that's kind of goes right into our ideology, is fix the world, because when you're fixing the world for you, it's connected to the next block, to the next block, to the next block, to the next life, to the next life, to the next ridge, to the next watershed, to the next people, to the next language, to the next ideology. And that's how we barter, we start understanding each other again, and we start living. But as we talk right now, we're about ready to go into another world war. So there you go for Indigenous ideology at its best. But I think that, as long as we're still building, and this is one of the belief systems I was handed off to, was that long as there's one person that understands the whole system, we're all right. We don't have that, but we have a lot of people in place, so we need to kind of get that back under our own control. Thank you for the long-winded comment.
Oh, thank you, Ron.
Mhm.
Gale, I saw you looking like you wanted to.
Well, interesting on some of the things that Ron was saying, because certainly when the commons were enclosed in England after the period of the agricultural revolution, the commoners couldn't understand why one person would want to have a field that they could grow crops that would produce more crops than they could eat. They just couldn't understand it, because in their culture, you only take as much as you need that day and you leave everything for the day after and the day after that. So government became very suspicious of commoners because they didn't kind of work. They didn't work long hours. They didn't need to, because they lived a subsistence life and they were quite happy with the life they were living. It's really difficult to control people who aren't plugged into the system. So you have to get them plugged into the system, and so for commoning was quite a threat to government, particularly in the 16th or 17th, 18th century. And so that was the pressure on commoners and to get rid of commons. And so I recognise some of the things that Ron was saying there, because that's certainly the experience of the commoners and some of the threats that they faced in the New Forest. But thankfully, their ancient rights were enshrined in statute law. So it wasn't common law. It was actually statute. It was intertwined with the laws that had protected the privileges of the elite. So that's how commoning in the New Forest managed to survive.
And Gale, that's rare, right? I mean, the New Forest there were so many commons all over England, and the New Forest is one of only a few that has survived. Is that right?
Yes, because after the period of the agricultural revolution, and certainly going into the industrial revolution, they Parliament just sold off all the royal forests. The reason that the New Forest survived and the Forest of Dean was because of the ability to produce timber for naval production, because the New Forest is very close to the naval port of Portsmouth. So it was much easier to get timber for shipbuilding down into Portsmouth. So that's one of the reasons. Strategically, it was very important. So yes, certainly the history of the latter history of the forest is very intertwined with the history of the Navy.
Well, and that is another crazy point of connection. So, England deforests itself to build substantially to build this navy that subsidizes imperialism, that enacts this imperialism, right? So England destroyed its own forests in order to access other forests to destroy. Right. And this is true for all imperial powers, right? Like Portugal had deforested itself and had to bring in all of its wood from the Canary Islands in short order in order to continue. European imperial powers were out of their own wood supply and started importing. I mean, not totally out, but out of the kind of mature oaks that they needed to build by 18th century. They were importing wood because they had destroyed so much to build the ships of empire.
And that was such a
forests.
Sounds like the Redwood Empire and the logging that went along through here during the World Wars as well, or after the World Wars to kind of reboot their economy. So I just wanted to kind of point out that again, I'm just noticing. I was always kind of thinking of my little childhood mind as how in the world can they come up with some of these things? But now I know they've already done it.
We did it to ourselves first, Ron.
Yeah,
It
definitely.
was such a common theme when I was reading and talking to different people all over the world that forests, and this is, part of what's so powerful about these trees, right, is that forests and woodlands and these communally managed spaces are a threat to empire and to colonial dominance, and they're spaces that are harder to control. And, you know, that's why the powers that be are trying to control fire. That's why the powers that be are trying to control some of these semi-feral animal species and the people who have a relationship with them. And, Gale, you just said something that, people who have this relationship with the land are hard to control, and people who have plentiful food are really hard to control. And I think for me, that became this central tenet of so many different stories that I was hearing. And the story that Joanna traced with the hazelnut tree is when you can take away people's food supply, and especially when you can convince people that there's actually no food in these ecosystems for them anyways. There's nothing there. You have to have a farm in order to eat food. There's no food in the quote unquote wilderness, no food in the new forest, no food in Karuk lands. You take away people's power, you take away their source of sustenance, and that is what our government and the elites of our society have been trying to do, and have done, unfortunately, in many cases quite successfully for hundreds of years. And that is also, I think the power of these conversations and the power of work like what Ron's doing to get those dams taken down, to bring fire back on the land, of what Gale and Anne are doing to continue keeping these ponies as commoners and exercise those rights. I think that, yeah, to me, that's it. That's sort of the kernel at all the bottom of it. And when we all realize that and come together across our differences, then that's where I think things begin again.
Okay. Okay. And as I'm listening to you all, I keep thinking about how much that learning the history can change our identity and our understanding of who we are, and of how, in learning each other's histories, learning these histories, I think of them as stories of interbeing, can shift our understanding of how we relate to one another and who the other is as well. Because our understanding of both ourselves and each other has been shaped, sometimes unfairly and inaccurately. And like when I teach the remembering course, all the time, bringing a cohort through it right now, and they're all adult learners and very well educated. And every lesson, they're like, "Oh, I didn't know." And at some point, like it's that always that heart wrenching process of like, "Oh, we're not who we thought we were. We're not who we thought we were. Oh, maybe there's someone else who we actually are. Maybe there's somebody else who we can be. Maybe there's someone else who we can be." And part of that, I think, is also, oh, there is someone else who we there's the some of who we might have been is who we might want to become. And I think some is so powerful is for me at least, certainly in like listening to tonight's conversation, or this conversation here, is like I also, growing up in the East Bay and Ohlone lands in California, where fire was seen as a grave danger, as definitely as Smokey the Bear Kid. And then I learned, but kind of it didn't take that long because of the context in which I grew up, that the native peoples throughout California had very different ways of dealing with fire, and that was very healthy for the land and could prevent the massive forest fires. And no one ever told me that Europeans also had similar ways of working with fire. And so my conception of where my ancestors were from is that we were always the problem. We were never part of the solution. We were always the ones who were extracting and who were damaging the environment. And as you were saying, Joanna and Gale, right, the extent to which, Queen Elizabeth cut down all of her own forests in order to build a Spanish armada, amongst others. And she was certainly not the only one. But the extent to which, I thought that my ancestors, my European ancestors, were from a people who were not just separate from, but were destructive of their own forest. And it wasn't. And then I was so shocked when I learned that fire was also a part of our traditions. And so that changed how I saw my ancestors, and that changed how I saw myself, and it changed how I understood these cross-cultural conversations. And so, suddenly European tradition can include people who work with fire, and who can include people who understood the sacred, and can also include. And I love this story about dragons, and it kind of makes me really curious to kind of look into some of those myths and stories and wonder what is there in the heart of the dragon. I just wanted to kind of quickly add, Joanna, to something you said earlier, this question about, where does it come from? We have a wonderful episode with Dr. Carol Cusack, who's from Australia, really trace through the process of how when Christianity comes into Europe, comes up into what we now think of as Northern and Western Europe, the extent to which sacred sites were destroyed. And this is in the 800s mostly, in exactly the same pattern that we subsequently see Europeans destroying sacred sites and sacred groves and wells across all over what we now think of as indigenous lands throughout the world. We also see patterns of cycles too, in which what starts in a colony, what starts far away from the center of empire, a pattern far away from the empire, becomes central to how the empire itself runs. So one of my favorite examples of that is in the sugar plantations in the Caribbean, in which that is one of the places where our current understanding of how time and the creation of clocks and the creation of round the clock workforces is actually first started in the plantations, and then subsequently is brought to the industrial time into the factories of England. So it's this reverse thing also happens, where something that begins a process of destruction and of shifting what industrialization, colonization looks like, is brought back to Europe. And that we see this also with property systems in what becomes the United States, the way in which property is experimented with and developed in early 1600s in the US is subsequently brought back. And the early forms of forestry from Europe would not have included some of the ways of thinking about forests, because certainly you would not have such a high level of fire suppression. And that came back to Europe and changed European forestry practices as well. And so you have these kind of cycles, and sometimes it goes one way and sometimes it goes the other way. And sometimes the same country or the same area or the same issue like forestry can go both ways, right? So it's not quite always a one directional thing. And it's really helpful to kind of trace those patterns of where things come from, and to recognize the extent to which some of that imperial force, we often categorize this as European versus non-European, and to recognize that within Europe there's an imperial force and there's a commoner force, and the forces of empire versus the forces of the common people. And those forces of empire can happen within China and India as well. We see some similar patterns in other colonial imperial forces, not just European, and to kind of recognize which aspects of these big dynamics are we talking about can be really helpful. And as Elspeth, as you were saying kind of towards the end there, just the incredible importance that with part of what's so exciting about your book and part of what's so exciting about the work that all of you are doing is that for all that we, I think, desperately need different histories and different resources to tell these histories and different ways of learning the histories, which is part of our work and part of the work that many of you are up with and up to and engaged in. there are so many ways in which it's both relearning the history and remembering, this process of remembering simultaneously and in conjuncture with and in process of revitalizing these cultural forms of management today, and the extent to which things are changing today, and this extent to which more people are learning how to feed people with trees and with forests and with forest agrosystems, as well as with other forms, and that we can indeed feed people in the traditional ways in which our ancestors were fed, even with the high level of populations that we have today. And the story that we can't do so is actually a lie. So I also just kind of want to give us a chance as we kind of land this podcast, land this episode, and we kind of bring it to a closure, to just kind of invite folks to kind of do a closing round of, something, if there's a story from like how you see things shifting and changing today, like kind of like where you see things moving and changing today. And all of you have mentioned a few things already. And or if there's something you've heard here in our I loved your phrase, Ron, the cyber roundtable. If there's something you've heard here that you want to lift up and kind of take forward, invite others to lift up and take forward. So stories from the present moment and something that's happening that you want to kind of lift up as we bring our conversation today to a close. And Elspeth, I'm going to give you the honor of going last.
Okay.
So, because I suspect you'll have many, many pieces on both of those. But is anyone else feeling like going first?
I guess, I just really appreciate the opportunity to be in the place that I'm at right now. It's been a lot of hard work. It's a testament to the Karuk world ideology is still here in place. We're still practicing. We're still praying. We're still walking the same trails. And we're trying to kind of like recreate a livable space, in America. And we're using fire suppression as that object of how can we participate, and having the platform with folks like you, having academia continually on my side, having a community in my heart, and then having the great creator for the blessings that we wish on ourselves, So those are the things we're still doing here in Northern California. And I really look forward to continuing my work in academia, with fire in the landscape, and with the intergenerational transfer of knowledge of fire ecology to the next gen. So I think those are the things that are very close to me and dear, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you and your audience, because I know these words that we've shared today are echoes around the world. So I really appreciate that. Never thought I'd be that kind of a guy, but it seems like with the right company, you never know. So I really appreciate that. Yo,
I can be very brief because I'm just very grateful, and I just want to express a lot of humility in the face of all that has been lost and all the learning that is to come, but also share the great joy that comes with slowly reconnecting appropriately in a good way to what I can reconnect with. So thank you for allowing me to be in this space, to Elspeth for your work and Sara for your work. Oh, and Ron and Gale, of course, that goes without saying. I just feel humble because they're the knowledge keepers,
Oh, Troy. Yeah, Troy.
So next month, the foals will start to be born on the forest, and it's always a magical time for me going out to check my mares to see if they've got any foals, if the foals have been born, and that's always wonderful. Looking at these amazing creatures who also hold the history of the forest in their DNA. There've been ponies in this part of the world since the Ice Age, and I just find it a magical time of year. The foals are being born, the new growth is coming through, and it just reminds me of how amazing nature is. if we can only learn to connect with it, and actually experience it without trying to control it.
Thank you, Gale. I keep thinking as we talk, there's probably a listener out there who was expecting us to just be talking about food this whole time and only nut trees and only food. And part of what I love about talking with each of you is that uh, food is like sort of this little kernel that we see of a much bigger story and a much bigger relationship. And it's hard to talk about food without talking about politics and grief and displacement and power and so many of these other structures in our life. So I am grateful to those of you who are thinking about acorns or something like that. That's how Ron and I started talking. That's how I reached out to each one of you because of a story about a nut. With Ron, we started talking about acorns. With Gale, I had heard that there was this place called the New Forest, and there was these rites to turn out animals to eat nuts in the fall, and that was how I got connected with Gale. And then Joanna, I heard about a song about a hazelnut, and so I love that through this lens of nuts, we've really looked at the bigger picture of why those are important and why we're talking about them in the first place. And as for something happening now, Ron, you and I haven't had a chance to catch up in a while, but I wanted to share something really exciting happening on the Outer Cape in Wellfleet, where I live. In January, we actually, a friend and I, initiated a prescribed fire training. We got the district fire warden to collaborate with us, with our group, Commons Keepers, and which, yes, Gale, is a nod to Commons Keepers in England, and we got 40 people to show up for this prescribed fire training in our small town, and there was so much excitement and so much enthusiasm. And so, all this time that we spent together hasn't just been talking. We're trying to learn how to do the work too. So it's really exciting, and we have our field day planned for April, and a really big group of people excited about learning to connect and care for the place where we live in a new way. So I'm pretty excited about that.
That's amazing. That's good to hear.
Well, it wouldn't have happened without you. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing that story, Elspeth. I also was thinking, I wrote down all these like facts about nuts and bison and yields, because I tend to work in these bigger cultural histories most of the time. And actually part of what I loved about your book was really the extent to which you were firmly disproving some of the stories that we need a particular form of farming in order to feed people, and that is simply not true, and that oaks, that with acorns and chestnuts and many other forms of nuts, but certainly acorns and chestnuts, there is so much of a food that we can return to. There are so many ancestral foodways that we can return to that bring food back and bring sovereignty back, and with that sovereignty, really has the power to challenge, has historically challenged empires and challenged these power structures. Self-sovereignty, collective food sovereignty, the commons is one of the biggest ways that you can shift global power structures. And so it's not just that we all like to eat. It's like food is this access point into song, into culture, into faith, into spirituality, and into really radical ways of living together. And we are at a point in our nation's history, as we're in this 250 year of for those of us in the United States, of thinking about this moment where we have an opportunity perhaps to tell some really radically different stories about where we come from and to create a really, really different set of where we might go. And I really think we need this cross the ocean conversation to do so. We need to do that with our commoner friends in England, and our Indigenous friends around the world, and to help return to a way of relating to Earth that is not based on domination, and that can actually come into relationship. So much appreciation to each of you for the things you've shared. I wrote down like many, many notes, and hopefully those of you who are listening have also been writing down many notes. And feel free to reach out to me if you want to go further in these topics, and if you want us to do more work in these topics. I'm going to bring these ideas to your community. And if you want to really get curious and practical about how to return to fire, how to return to water, how to return to nut trees, how to return to the commons. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Remembering and Re-Enchanting podcast. If you are enjoying what you are hearing, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I am always happy to hear from you, dear listener, to continue finding ways to connect the disconnected and go deeper on your own journey of remembering and re-enchanting with your communities, your organizations, and your families. I invite you to check out our courses and other community offerings via the Sequoia Summit Via website. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Though I must admit I spend much more time working with really amazing people than crafting social media. If you want to work with me one-on-one or bring me to speak at your organization or family office, you can find out more at sarajolena.com.